So I know it's mostly known as the dark night of the soul. I've also heard it called the dark night of the ego, which makes more sense to me and sounds more accurate because I feel like it's definitely more of a dark night for the ego than it is for the soul. Whether you call it the dark night of the soul or dark night of the ego, I'm just going to be calling it the dark night. So I think of the dark night as an ego death. It can be, at times for most of us, a very slow, painful ego death where you're just dealing with each layer upon layer upon layer. So it can last a while. That is the slower awakening. And before my depression, my dark night depression, I have had quite a few dark nights already. But it definitely wasn't as challenging and difficult as this one had been. So in 2010, I went on a silent meditation retreat. It was a really good experience, but what came out of that was the initiation of my deep, long lasting dark night. It lasted for so long, I think because I resisted a whole lot of it. So a lot of that time was just stuck being in resistant mode and trying to hold off this dark night depression that I knew was coming at some point or another. So my dark night lasted a really long time. One of the first major ego deaths I experienced was the stripping of my personality. I had spent years building up this personality to help keep me safe, to help me survive out in the world. It was definitely relying on being a people pleaser, being agreeable, coming off as happy and friendly. And all this came from a fear of not being good enough. That if people saw my true self, they wouldn't like me. So I tried my best to hide that by being this super nice person that everybody liked so that no one could say anything bad, hopefully, about me. I had so much fear around rejection. So I really relied heavily on this personality to help keep me safe, to keep me under the radar. I went through many phases in my life where I had to wear different masks for different groups that I was trying to fit into. And the thing that was driving me the most was just the fear of being seen for who I truly was. So I hid behind a mask in different groups and I would just try my best to fit in. I was basically a really good chameleon because I didn't feel like I ever belonged anywhere. I didn't feel comfortable being me, and I felt like I had to hide that. So it was really challenging getting stripped of my personality because this was my life raft. I relied on it so heavily with dealing with people. So the personality I had built up over the years actually had personality. I was actually even funny at one point and had some wit. I was able to hold conversations with people and not be weird or anything like that. Because without this personality, I was very socially awkward. I'm really shy, I'm really reserved, so I relied heavily on this personality to get me through social settings. So being stripped of this personality felt so threatening to me. It felt threatening to my ego because I felt so naked without it, so vulnerable. I felt like I was going through my weird teenage stage again. I felt like I was going through that phase a second time around. And I felt that, I didn't know who I was becoming. That was in the world of the unknown. It was unfamiliar, a scary space to be in. So I knew that I was afraid to go forward. But then I was stripped of this personality that I knew wasn't the real me. I knew it was a fake personality, an act I put on. So when I was stripped of that, I didn't know who I was anymore. So I was stuck in this no man's land for so long. My ego resisted it, and it lasted on for years. That's why my spiritual growth was so slow, because I had resisted moving forward for so long. So I basically just relied on my false self, my old personality. I continued on with life as usual, knowing that I was pretending, that this wasn't truly who I was, but I wanted to stay in the familiar space that I was in. I wanted to stay there. I was attached to it. I didn't want to move forward. So I resisted my growth and I was so lost in this space. I just kept distracting myself. I kept socializing and relying on this old personality that I knew really wasn't me. But I was just too scared to move forward, like I said, to the unknown, to the unfamiliar. I grew this really strong desire to get into hermit mode, to basically go within and be by myself. But of course, I resisted that. I didn't allow myself to do that. I was so bad at saying no. I had very poor boundaries. So I would always be saying yes to everything, going out socializing, and I became really resentful about everything and everyone. Although it wasn't anyone's fault, it was completely my own because, like I said, I have no good boundaries and I wasn't able to say no. But mostly because I didn't honor myself for what I felt like I needed at that time in my life. I needed to go into hermit mode. I had such a strong desire to do that, but I didn't listen. I just kept on doing life as usual. But then it got to a point where I couldn't resist anymore because going on with life, pretending to be this personality that I relied on wasn't working anymore. I felt so numb. I felt so unfulfilled. I felt so dead inside. It felt like a very empty period in my life. Even though I was going out socializing, doing all these so-called fun things and being with friends, I felt like something was missing. So eventually I allowed myself to get into hermit mode. I slowly started to socialize less and less. I learned to say no. And the only major events I would go to would be for weddings and things like that. So things in my life were slowly starting to change. I was petrified about that, but I knew that it was inevitable. I eventually quit my full-time office job and decided to start my own business and work for myself. Then by 2016, I hit rock bottom, and that was the beginning of my dark night depression. It lasted for almost 4 years, and it was a very challenging and painful time in my life. The more I allowed myself to get into hermit mode, to go more inward, that was when all this inexplicable, deep-rooted pain started to surface. I experienced so many states of deep depression. It was very emotionally painful and heavy. You know, some of the most simple tasks became very difficult for me. Getting out of bed at days were very challenging, and even taking a shower was one of the most difficult tasks I could do. I could barely take care of myself anymore, and it was very challenging. Going to the grocery store was such a chore. Basically, everyday life started to become very challenging and very difficult. I could barely maintain anything in my life anymore. There were days of uncontrollable crying, you know, the really ugly, sobbing cries, for what almost seemed like for no reason other than the pain that I felt, the emotions that I felt. I didn't know what the reasons were a lot of times. Sometimes I did, but they weren't very often that I knew. Those were actually kind of the better days where I was able to release and cry. But those days of deep states of depression were very heavy. They were overwhelmingly negative, very dark. And I did question a lot of times, you know, if I was going to make it through. There were days where you'd feel like you no longer had the will to live. You know, apathy became such a part of my life during that period. You feel like hopeless. You feel like there's no point in anything anymore. So it was a very discouraging, very dark period of my life. And because it lasted for years, it was very scary because I didn't know if it was gonna ever end. During that time, I had to deal with my past. I had to come to terms about my childhood and my whole experience of it. You know, I came to the realization of having a very painful and traumatic childhood. Not by anything, you know, not by any big events or anything like that. Just having the experience of being emotionally neglected and having a narcissistic mother. You know, I had to deal a lot with feelings of rejection from my own extended family. And through all the pain that I had gone through during childhood, I repressed a lot of it. I didn't show any of my emotions because I learned early on that that wasn't good, that my mom didn't like it. So I became really repressed about my emotions and kept it all in. So now going through my dark night depression, I had to deal with all that. All that stuff was surfacing up and I had to deal with it. So it was very challenging. I, as a kid, was very sad. I was very angry and depressed. But I was so numb to all these emotions. I became such a numb person, and I would just try to find ways to survive and not have to deal with those feelings. I remember as a child often feeling like I didn't want to exist. That was before I understood the concept of suicide or anything like that. But I definitely always felt like I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to exist. I was actually pretty angry about being born. I remember just thinking to myself often, like, why the heck was I put here? I didn't want to be born. I didn't ask to be born. So I was really angry about that. I was angry at my mom for birthing me because I didn't want to be here. I felt like it was such a painful experience to be born into this world. When I was in those moments of deep states of depression, of that dark, heavy feeling that consumed me, I started to more often think about ending it all. Suicidal ideation definitely became a thing in my life during that time period of my depression. I really did question if I could make it through a lot of times. It was so heavy, I didn't know if I could make it through. And I did definitely think about ending it all a lot. I remember when that time frame when Chris Cornell and Chester Bennington had passed away from suicide. I remember being deeply triggered by that because it brought up so much fear in me, because I didn't know if I could trust myself that I wouldn't do something like that. I got really scared, and I remember feeling a lot of fear around that. I really didn't trust myself or my mindset during that time. So of course it's sad when anyone passes, and especially through suicide. I remember specifically being very sad though about Anthony Bourdain when he had passed away through suicide as well. You know, I remember watching all his shows, and I just felt like he was someone that I could totally be friends with in real life. So, you know, when you see someone who has this amazing job, he gets to travel the world, eat great food, have great friends, and see amazing things. But then we don't know what's going on in their life, how they're suffering, you know? So when he passed away by suicide, I was very sad about that. So feeling so down and out to the point that you question whether or not you want to continue on with life, that can be very challenging. So through the depression, I remember wanting to get through it a lot faster. I was hoping that if I meditated more, I could get through it faster. If I did other healthy things, it would help me get through it a lot faster. But I realized that that was just an act of resistance, that I wasn't really fully accepting the experience because I wanted to get through it faster. I didn't allow myself to fully experience the depression because I was trying to find other ways to get through it. So instead of allowing myself to be sad when I wanted to be sad and fully experiencing it, or allowing myself to overindulge in food if I wanted to, I really tried to find ways from the spiritual toolbox to try to get myself through it a lot faster. I was trying to find a way to cure my depression. But like I said, that was an act of resistance. So the biggest lesson for me there, looking back now in hindsight, is that I really should have taken care of my depression, of my dark night, rather than trying to cure it. I remember one of my really depressed moments. I was crying uncontrollably, doing the whole ugly sobbing cry, and feeling like I didn't know if I was going to make it through, feeling like I wanted to end it all, feeling like I wanted to do something drastic. But I remember I was just trying to get myself through each minute. Just one more minute, just one more minute, just one more minute. And luckily I made it through, but it was very challenging. It was some of the most difficult pain I've ever felt. Afterwards, when I got through it, I decided to listen to a podcast. It was Michael Singer on Oprah. And I remember thinking, okay, I didn't really want to listen to the whole thing. I just wanted to listen to something more positive. So I just randomly stopped on a spot in the podcast. And Michael Singer talked about how Jesus had said, you need to die to be reborn again. And he meant that on a spiritual level, so even though I had heard that before and I knew that, I kind of felt like it was a spiritual hug I needed to hear in that moment because of what had happened just earlier. I forgot that in those moments of deep pain where I'm questioning existence, that it doesn't have to be a physical death. Although sometimes it ends up being like that for some people, but it's about an ego death, to be reborn spiritually. The only thing I guess helped me through those dark times was just thinking to myself, let's get through just this 1 minute. And then just keep repeating that to myself. 1 more minute, 1 more minute. So luckily, that simple task of just trying to hang on to each moment really helped. So we need to remember that we need to let the ego die in order to be spiritually reborn.